be swapping out the factory valve springs in an MR8-8DE head, which is the same spring setup as the MR16 DDT, the MR18DE, MR20, pretty much any MR engine uses the same spring setup. So we're swapping out the factory springs with these upgraded SuperTech springs with titanium retainers. Not only are these lighter than the factory retainers, but these springs have been shown to support up to 11,000 RPM. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take these buckets out, keeping careful to make sure we remember where each one goes. Paper towel or something labeled is an easy way to remember how to do that. So to take the buckets out, just take a magnet and just stick it on there, and they pop right out just like that. Now, you can do this swap with the head in the car. You just put some compressed air into the cylinders and put that cylinder top dead center. It's a little harder, and I'll show you why. It relates to the keepers that hold that in place. Prefer to do it by just taking the head off. In this case, the head was already off as we're doing a port injection conversion. So we're just going to do it this way. So buckets out, and then we'll get to taking the springs out. With the buckets removed, the next step is to physically take the old springs out. Now to do that, we are going to compress the spring with a special tool that I'll show you in a second to get out little things we called keepers. They're right there. They look like this when they're not on the spring and retainer. They're really easy to get out. It's getting them back in that can be a little tricky. So I'll see if I can show you some tricks to do that. It's just a matter of patience. When you do the valve spring compression tool, you need to go very slowly to make sure that you don't damage the valve. I'll show you how to do that. This is the valve spring compressor tool that I use. It's pretty simple. So you open this all the way up. That side goes on the valve face, so that's the part of the valve that's in the combustion chamber. And then this side is what goes on the retainer. And then when you press this down, it will eventually lock into place. And when that does, this will be sitting low enough for you to take a magnet and pull the keepers out. So it's very important that when you put this on the valve, you get it as centered as possible. If you push on the edge of the valve or you miss the valve and it like rolls off, you could damage the valve with the valve seat. So be very careful doing that. This one has already been adjusted to do these heads since I do so many of them. But when you get these, you do have to fiddle around with them until you find lengths that will work with the head that you're taking apart. So I have the bottom part centered on the valve. I'll show you that in a second. And I have this on up here. We're just gonna push it in and it pops. And you can see those keepers came right out. We're gonna take a magnet, just go in there and remove them. So you can see I have that centered on the valve. Now the intake valves are bigger than the exhaust valves, so it's a lot easier to get centered. The exhaust side, the valve's almost the exact same size as that cup, so you have to be very careful when you're doing that. But once you have the keepers out, all you do is gently release the tool, move the tool out of the way, and then your spring and retainer come right out. So I'm going to go ahead and just take the rest of these out. It takes about, I don't know, 10 minutes to get them all out, taking your time, making sure you're not damaging the valves. I'm not going to force you through watching that because it's the exact same process as that, just over and over again until they're all out. All right, so I just popped the new valve springs in there just because it was quick. So before I put the last one in, let's do a quick comparison between that, which is the aftermarket one, and that, which is your factory one. Now, as you can see, there's less coils here, which helps with the reduction of binding if you were to add more lift via an upgraded camshaft. But this is also a lot stronger. When we sent out a set of factory springs to SuperTech to start developing this kit, we had them check the intake and exhaust valves, and the compression rates and such, which here's an intake valve and an exhaust valve, the compression rates are the same, but you'll notice the yellow ones, which is exhaust, are taller. The compression rate on them is about the same, but the ratio of how far they compress to how strong they get, as you can see it's a progressive spring rate, is different. So you'll notice that these valves are, the upgraded springs, are a bit of a happy medium as far as the height goes, but because these are so much stronger, it really doesn't matter. Like I said, we have run this to a 11,000 RPM, 10,800 to be exact, and we had no valve float. So they're significantly stronger, which means they don't have to be as tall as these ones. And you can see they all sit in there pretty much exactly the same height. You can use the reference from the cam journal to the tops of them to kind of see that. So now we're going to do the hard part, which is physically putting the keepers in. And this is going to be hard for me to film, so I'll get a spring compressed and then show you what you need to do, but you will need almost this exact tool to do it, which is a 45-degree, very thin needle nose plier. And you'll notice that the end of mine is actually bent out. I did that on purpose, and you'll see why in a second. I have this spring compressed, and as you can see, I can move the top of the spring around. Now, that's important because we do actually need this thing to stay centered. So what I usually do is I'll actually stick something in there up against what I'm using the tool with to hold it centered. That's kind of important because if it's down like this, you can actually drop a keeper down through where the valve is, and then you gotta take the spring out and hunt that down. And if you've done all of these and then you drop a keeper and it shifts, you might send the keeper all the way down to the other side, and it might end up underneath one of these, which means you gotta take this apart. It's a whole thing. So we're gonna go ahead and get this centered by propping this up so that we don't have to focus on holding that. We do want to be able to wiggle it around a little bit, but we also want it to stay centered. So we've got that fairly centered. I just took a junk rod that I had laying around and propped it up. I also gave myself the ability to wiggle this around a little bit. So now comes the hard part, which is putting the keepers in. I'm gonna try to film this, but I'm gonna be filming with my left hand, so sorry if it's a bit shaky. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we have the keeper being held by the tip of the needle nose. So you can see why I bent that out. It allows me to squeeze really tight without this completely squeezing down on the keeper, possibly damaging it. So now what we're gonna do is this has a tendency to lean that way. So we wanna get that keeper in first. So again, I'm gonna try to get it so you guys can see this. We are gonna set the keeper down in there. You can see it right there. And then it pops in. And then when I lean that off to the side, you will see, at least I think you can, that the keeper is in there. So now we just have to put the other one in, which is where it becomes a bit of a difficult thing to do. So I'll try to film that too. So again, we're holding it this way. I'm just gonna set it in the slot so you can see it's not all the way down, but it's sitting in on the cone shape. And I'm just gonna give it a little push, a little wiggle. Sometimes they take a little more encouragement than others. Oh, and just popped it out. So hold on, I'm not gonna be able to film this, but you get the idea. Yeah, so I needed two hands because I have to be able to wiggle this around. But you can see that it's in there, and you notice that there's a big gap there. So when I release this, you see how it pops up? We can now verify that that is in there all the way. So that is the process, and now I have to go and do that to all of these. And it is very tedious. Putting them back in, depending on how shaky your hands are or how your tools are or how everything's fitting. It's taken me an hour to do this before. If they go smooth, like that one went fairly smooth, you know, you might be able to do this in 10 minutes. But again, if you drop a keeper down and it all falls, and you gotta take it apart, and it's a whole thing. So it's all about patience. So I'm gonna go ahead and get the rest of these in and then show you what it looks like when it's done, and also show you the measurements you need to take after you do this. All right, those are all in. That took me about 17 minutes. Watched a little Doug DeMuro while I was doing it. So the next part is we gotta put the buckets back in. Now, when you go to put the buckets back in, they have to go back where they go, or you're gonna have to do a valve lash adjustment. But regardless of if you put them in the right spot or not, you need to check the valve lash to make sure that keeper position and different heights don't affect anything. I have yet to come across an instance when it did, but it's very important that you still check that because you don't want to put this thing together and then it makes a god-awful ticking noise, or one of the valves doesn't close up all the way. So to put the buckets back in, all you do is take your bucket. The exhaust side buckets are smaller, in case you mixed up which ones are which, and then they just pop in like that. Intake side, same deal. They just pop in like that, and you just push them all the way down. So we'll go ahead and put the rest of these in. All right, those are all in. To check your valve lash, you have to put the cams in it and torque everything down, and then check your lash. What I'll do is up on the screen right now, I'll put a screenshot from the factory service manual showing what your adjustments are. Or if you don't want to have to deal with looking for the factory service manual, measure your lashes and list them out on a piece of paper before you do this, and then go back and just make sure that they're the same or very, very close. But that is all it takes to put those in. Again, if the engine is in the car, it's a bit more complicated. You need a different kind of tool. Highly recommend taking the head out to do it. It's not that big of a deal. That's how you put those valve springs in, and now you're ready for a 10,000 RPM rip, unless you're direct injected. In that case, good luck.